Table Talk podcast, where no discussion about the dinner table is off the table.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second episode of EDAC's Table Talk podcast. My name is Kyle Buchan, the research assistant for EDAC, and today I'll be joined by Fergus Murray. Fergus will be talking to us about monotropism and the potential role of monotropic cognition in the development of eating disorders for autistic people. Thank you so much for joining me today, Fergus. I'm very excited about getting this conversation underway. But before that, please just introduce yourself to everyone listening.
I'm Fergus Murray. I'm autistic, ADHD. I was identified as autistic about 15 years ago, at the age of 31, and ADHD earlier this year. I'm the chair and one of the co-founders of Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh, AMAZE, and I've been teaching science for about the last 10 years in classrooms until this term. I'm now a private tutor, and I'm a writer. So I write about autism and neurodiversity and monotropism in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your Monotropism website is brilliant actually, and I'll with your permission I'll link that to this episode, because I think for those interested it's a great way to get interested and learn more about the topic in a very accessible way. So I'll definitely include that in the episode. So I guess for those who maybe aren't familiar with monotropism, or have maybe heard it but are not entirely sure what that encompasses, I wonder if you could just tell us, what is monotropism when we say that?
So monotropism, which gets pronounced in a variety of different ways. My mum, Dinah Murray, developed the theory and never took a strong stance on how to pronounce it, so that's fine. So monotropism is a theory of autism, initially, which suggests that the basic difference between autistic people and the rest of you is that we tend to concentrate our attention and processing resources on a smaller number of things at a time, so that our attention and processing are more intensely invested in wherever our attention is, with less left over for other things, including things like filtering. So that's quite an important aspect, in my view. The more your attention is used up and the more you're depleted from having to pay attention to things, the less energy you have left over for filtering out things like outside noises, distractions. So because we invest our attention heavily in things, it's typically harder for us to switch attention, at least once we're fully invested. So it tends to take time and be kind of destabilizing when we have to switch attention rapidly. Although I should say that this depends quite a lot on a bunch of different things. So sometimes people hear that and they think, oh, well, that's like the opposite of ADHD. But then actually, it turns out, most autistic people qualify, like they meet the criteria for ADHD. And the sort of attention hopping style associated with ADHD processing is not something ADHDers do all the time. Actually, most ADHDers will tell you that they hyperfocus when something really grabs their attention, when it's something which they're particularly interested in, or which their brain decides to go all in on, then they will hyperfocus. And I think the kind of the inattention, skipping from one thing to another, is partly because we get trained out of that. We learn that it's not safe to invest all of our attention in something, so we invest at a shallow level and habitually skip from one thing to another. I think that's roughly what's going on. So yeah, I introduced monotropism as a theory of autism. It may also describe why most autistic people are ADHD-ish, and there's generally so much overlap as well. Preliminary tests of a measure that a bunch of us developed called the Monotropism questionnaire suggests that in the population at large, there's a sort of wide distribution of monotropicness, and overwhelmingly, autistic people are quite a lot more monotropic than the population at large. ADHD people tend to be significantly more monotropic than non-ADHD people, and that's true both with and without the autism. So the most monotropic people are ADHDers. And people who think of themselves as neurotypical are likely to be relatively polytropic, you know, the opposite of monotropic. And ADHD is a sort of somewhere in the middle there.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much. That's such a kind of, you've done well to kind of succinctly do that, because monotropism, I think, well, why monotropism is so appealing to me is that it, unlike previous theories before it, you can see its application across various autistic traits. It isn't limited to, you know, a particular aspect of being autistic. I also think it's important to note that monotropism is autistic led and very much strength based as well, which again I think is historically been something that's definitely been lacking. So yeah, thank you so much. So you mentioned the monotropism questionnaire, and I believe that was developed last year.
No.
Oh, no.
I mean, well, depends what you mean by developed. So it was started in 2021, I guess. A guy called Richard Woods initiated the project, drew up the initial list of questions, and a mailing list that I was running, the interest system mailing list. Basically a bunch of autistic people kind of fed back on the draft questions and added their own suggestions and so on. So I can't actually bring up the exact timescale off the top of my head. But what happened was we developed the questionnaire, and a master's student, Valeria Garral, a student of Sue Fletcher-Watson's at the University of Edinburgh, did her master's project on it. So she put the questionnaire online, invited participants from various internet sources, and within about a week had more than 1,000 respondents.
Wow.
Yeah, which I think is a measure of how much interest there is in monotropism, certainly in online autistic communities. Which I should say has been a long time coming. So, you know, you referred to like older theories of autism, and yeah, it's kind of funny actually that most of the theories of autism that are still taught routinely in autism courses are like really old, and haven't particularly stood the test of time, but they're still widely taught. But Dinah started talking about monotropism in the early 90s. So her first paper on it at the Durham conference was in 1992. So it's been very slowly building for a long time. You know, it's always had autistic people hearing about it and be like, yes, that makes sense. Finally, someone is actually explaining my experiences. But the major paper on it was published in 2005. Attention, monotropism and the diagnostic criteria for autism, which very clearly showed that all of the diagnostic criteria and various other features of autism could be explained like quite clearly and concisely by this one theory, without assuming deficits on the part of autistic people.
No, absolutely. And yeah, like you say, you know, I think some people think monotropism as a theory is newer than it actually is, because it, like you say, it's been a long time coming. And again, I think what you're saying about other theories being taught still, I think again that's reflective of the kind of the absence of the autistic voice in autism research and autistic practice as well. So it's really good that Monotropism has.
In a big way.
Absolutely. So I guess, yeah, why we're here today is to talk about like how monotropic thinking may impact autistic people's eating behaviors, and whether you think that's the case, and if so, how that could potentially lead to disordered eating amongst autistic people.
Yeah, so my take is that monotropism shapes everything about autistic experience, pretty much. I won't go so far as to say that it explains everything about autistic experience, because people are complicated. And a full explanation of anybody's experience requires bringing in a whole lot of stuff about how humans work and their personal experiences and so on. So one aspect is the sort of intense investments of attention that I was talking about, which tends to lead to intense experiences. So if you think about that in the context of eating, so like I have an intense aversion to eggs, just to give you an example. So to cooked eggs, like it's so bad that if someone has fried some eggs in a frying pan and it hasn't been really thoroughly washed up, then when it heats up again, I'll want to gag from the smell.
Right.
And that's that's something that's developed over time. I don't know why. I used to be able to eat eggs just about, and then like it just got worse and worse until now. It's a really intense thing that I just cannot tune out. And a lot of autistic people have these sensory aversions. Often textures, sometimes smells, tastes, obviously. So that sort of inability to tune things out, I think, is quite a big part in the way that autistic people eat. And related to that, and this sort of connects with a lot of autistic experiences around routines and sameness. Once you have got used to the idea that unknown experiences are likely to be horrible, which is just a thing that happens to be true for a large proportion of autistic people, you tend to get used to wanting things to be the same, right? Or at least to be somewhat predictable, and to have some autonomy over things. So a big part of the reason why autistic people have a reputation for thriving on routines and wanting things to be the same all the time is because if they're not the same, they might be awful. And not only might they be awful, but people won't believe how awful they are. And that happens a lot. Autistic experiences are constantly invalidated. And one of the things about trauma, like I hesitate to use the term because it's such a loaded one and such a big one, but I think it's a useful frame for thinking about this stuff. So some people have been talking about the idea of sensory trauma, which I think is kind of a helpful framing. If your experiences are not validated, you're much more likely to have a long-term strong reaction to them. If you can if you feel like held and understood in the moments after the traumatic experience, it's less likely to develop into a serious post-traumatic response.
No, absolutely. And I think that trauma is a loaded word. However, it definitely has full utility in this context. And it's definitely something that we've seen in our prior investigations at EDAC, both kind of food-related traumas, as you were mentioning, but also social traumas as well. And to go back to what you were saying about routine, I think routine is such an interesting one because it can act as both a maintenance factor for eating disorders, but it also can be a facilitator to recovery. So our participants have reported kind of utilizing routine as a way to get into better routines with food and eating disorder related behaviors. And so actually I think what that highlights is the importance of using these kind of strength-based frameworks that maybe utilize the proclivity of autistic people to engage in these routine behaviors and actually use that as a strength for their recovery rather than focusing on it as a negative for like maintaining their eating disorders. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah. Something that's worth talking about a bit more there, I think, is control. So a lot of things that autistic people do to feel okay relate to feeling in control. You know, if the world feels very destabilizing, then having some kind of input that you can control is very comforting. It's a very powerful thing. I think this is pretty much the main reason that autistic people stim. It's a you know, self-stimulating behavior is about feelings that you're in control of. They're predictable. They can help you to tune out other things. And my sense is that quite a lot of what's seen as disordered eating in autistic people is about that. You know, people think about anorexia as being about wanting to be thin, and of course it can be, but certainly for a lot of autistic people, that's not what it's about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's actually a really key distinction to make as well in terms of potentially different mechanisms operating in, say, anorexia nervosa in autistic people versus non-autistic people. And again, that's not something that's currently reflected that much in practice, in terms of actually a lot of our assumptions are based on these kind of neurotypical presentations. So yeah, I think that was really important to make that distinction as well. So I guess, like, leading from that, I mean, we've kind of touched on this already, but I guess, are there particular parts of the monotropism questionnaire that you think would be useful in potentially adapting or utilizing in eating disorder research that might tell us, I guess, a bit more about how monotropism is interacting in that process?
I'd have to read through it again. Do you have it in mind?
Well, I think I think again, because there's so many different eating disorder presentations, it'd be difficult to say, you know, oh, this would be across kind of all presentations. However, I'm thinking potentially, for example, aspects of people with ARFID who may simply just forget, like they or have a lack of interest in eating, let's say, and I know that there's like aspects of the monotropism questionnaire which touch on being engaged in a flow state and forgetting to eat or drink, or not recognizing hunger and thirst. So that might be one that would be worth exploring in that context.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one of the things about the sensory side of monotropism is difficulty processing multiple channels at once. It's something which, you know, we can get better at. If we practice something a lot, then we might start to experience them as one kind of unified whole. But this means that if our attention is strongly engaged somewhere, for example, if we're in a flow state, you know, if we're really kind of in the zone, focusing on one particular thing, we're likely to miss interoceptive signals altogether. So yeah, if you're too absorbed in something, you might not notice that you need to eat, that you need to pee, that you need to drink.
Yeah.
That's a really, really common experience. Yeah, so there's a sort of interesting interplay between these different factors, right? We talk about disordered eating, and it's definitely a thing, I think, but it's not necessarily a very well-defined thing. So if someone can't eat, or they're just forgetting to eat because they're too busy doing something, like, is that an eating disorder, or is that not really the right way to look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like, I'm going to keep going back to it, but that is because the language used is based on kind of this neuronormative expectations of this is a normal eating pattern. You eat at this time, you eat this type of food at this time, all these kind of things. So yeah, when we say disordered eating, for one person, their disordered eating is another person's perfect meal, so you can't really compare. And I think that is definitely something that we need to work on within academia and clinical practice, is actually looking at what these terms mean and if they actually apply to a more inclusive range of people as well. And you actually briefly mentioned this, where you spoke about there's other factors involved. So I guess kind of leading on to that is that, given that monotropism is kind of obviously it's presented as like an overarching cognitive processing style for autistic people, to kind of simplify it, but that not all autistic people go on to develop disordered eating behaviours. If there was potentially other factors that you thought kind of interacted with monotropic thinking style to lead on to disordered eating. So I know earlier you mentioned trauma. So I wondered if you had any kind of other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly trauma and stress, the ways that people react, because eating is something that we don't mostly do in isolation. Actually, like, people tend to eat around other people, and the messages that people get about what's okay to eat and how it's okay to eat and what's bad and all of this stuff can add up. I guess it's worth mentioning orthorexia here as well. So people who have very strict rules about what they can and can't eat, and I think that's quite common for autistic people to develop rules about things in order to sort of control how they're going to go down, and also in order to reflect their moral code. So I mean, I've been vegetarian since I was about 8, because I sort of realized that other animals have experiences, and we have a choice about how much suffering we're happy to inflict on them. And I think that was a healthy choice for me. But I am aware that it is possible to really take those rules and run with them in a way that can become unhealthy. And I think, to bring that back to monotropism, that can be about things like reducing cognitive load. So if you have a few simple rules for what it's okay to eat, then you don't have to weigh up so many things at once. And weighing up a lot of things at once can be a real struggle for monotropic people, because it's like you're thinking about one thing and then you have to weigh that up against another thing, and just holding too many separate things in your head at once can be a strain.
Yeah, I think the cognitive load stuff, absolutely. I mean, again, just to kind of, because it's fresh in my mind, to reflect on a study we've just done at the moment, is the photo voice stuff, and routine was mentioned in that as well, because the predictability, it just meant that there was less decision making involved, so that people could kind of place more energy into what they found difficult, which was actually eating. But other strategies were like to use the same cutlery so that they could reduce washing up. So that was kind of, there was emphasis on kind of their like pre and post consumption stages of meals, basically, that just reduced the overall cognitive load, which meant that people could, like I say, place more emphasis on actually eating. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I guess, like, just kind of leading on from that, just as like my last kind of comment is, I think, do you have any advice for academics and clinicians in terms of how to how to address certain parts of the autistic experience. For example, like these, let's say, for example, preference for beige foods as an example, where that might be something that that individual relies on heavily. However, it may have kind of long-term health complications in terms of diet, nutritional deficiency and stuff. But for me, it's a difficult balance about respecting the autistic person as and not trying to enforce these neuronormative standards, but at the same time also making sure that they are healthy and that these potential behaviors aren't going to have long-term negative effects. And I think, especially as a neurotypical person in autism research, I think that is something that I struggle with conceptualizing, is how to kind of develop research that's going to help autistic people without seeming like we're trying to change them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult one. I guess one thing to say to start with is there's obviously a lot of overlap between autism and eating disorders, and yet the ways that people tend to think about things like anorexia, like you say, are not really developed with autistic people in mind. So there's a lot of just fundamental misunderstandings going on, I think, where you see autistic youth being institutionalized because they have avoidant, restricted food intake, where it's sensory issues. It's not that they're choosing not to eat, really. They're unable to eat. So, I mean, anyone working in this field really needs to have a baseline understanding of autism from autistic people, because there's a lot of really unhelpful stuff out there written by neurotypicals about autism. So yeah, I mean, that's just as a starting point, listen to autistic people. But it's definitely difficult. Like you say, there are long-term health implications for some of these things, and it's never going to be easy to balance someone's autonomy against them being safe and the other people being safe. I guess respecting autonomy as much as you can, like listening to people about what they think will work for them and what they're confident won't work. Sometimes people get that wrong, and it turns out they do like green eggs and ham or whatever. But for the most part, people have a pretty good sense of what is going to be horrible for them. So if you can avoid doing things which are going to be horrible, that's a pretty good starting point. I acknowledge that that's not always going to be easy. A lot of things, if someone feels safe to try something, then they might try it and they might turn out to like it. If they feel pressured into it, bullied into it, that's more likely to put them off that thing for the long term. So, I know a lot of autistic people who 30 years on from being forced to eat something as a kid still won't touch it. And I don't think that's just an autistic thing, but I think it's the kind of thing that's more likely to stick for autistic people.
No, absolutely. And I think safety is key, and it kind of goes back to what you're saying earlier with trauma, in terms of if that experience is invalidated, people aren't going to feel safe, and though it's just gonna keep happening. I think it's the same with food as well. Like you say, people need to be safe to feel that they can potentially push themselves or explore something new. So I think that is really important.
A lot of the time people are told, like, it's not that bad. Like, people just don't understand how bad it is. They don't know what the mouthfeel is like for you.
No,
they don't know what the experience of that smell is going to be, and yet people will just insist it's going to be fine. Just try a little bit. Like, I'm gagging on the smell. Why do you want me to try a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, the takeaway message there is involve lived experience as much as we can, and actually like meaningfully do that as well. I think there has been again a bit of a historic tokenism, if I can say that, in terms of that people have said, autistic people have been involved in the research, but actually it's not really been an accessible methodology and those kind of things. So Fergus, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been super interesting, especially on a personal note, as someone who's super interested in monotropism and your work in particular. It's been a privilege to have you here today. So thank you so much for joining me.
That concludes today's episode of the EDAC Table Talk podcast. Thank you again, Fergus, for a truly insightful conversation. And of course, thank you to all our listeners. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, you can contact me on my email address, which is kbuchan@ed.ac.uk. And if you want to learn more about EDAC, you can visit our website at edacresearch.co.uk. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.